So, hey guys, welcome. And today we have an interesting topic that I want us to just talk about. And it's based on this theory by one Heider, which goes to say that a friend of my friend is my friend, an enemy of my friend is my enemy, and the friend of my enemy is my enemy, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend. I will repeat: a friend of my friend is my friend, an enemy of my friend is my enemy, the friend of my enemy is my enemy, and the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So, in simple terms, we could say the enemy of my enemy is my friend, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and the friend of my enemy is my enemy. Pause a little bit and think about that theory. So, basically, we're going to look at this theory even from a mathematical perspective and to see whether it suffices. Fritz Heider or Fritz Heider, whoever you would call it, was a psychologist who came up with this theory in the 1940s. It is called the balance theory, and it simply explains how people form friendships or alliances, or how even they form enmities. So it explains that relationship between people and how they form alliances and how they form friendships. So the theory itself was described in what we call the P-O-X triangular framework. So Heids came up with this triangular framework to describe this relationship. He came up with what we call the Heider balance. So what you're seeing here, um, the statement that the sign of a two-step relation is the product of the edge signs. So the sign of a two-step relation is the product of the edge signs. So we have a positive sign and we have the negative sign. So these are the two signs that we are going to consider in this case, whereby we are being told that the signs of a two-step relation is the product of the edge sign. So if we want to define a relationship and find out whether the existing relationship is a friendship or an enmity, then the product of those existing signs, of the edge signs here, for example, P to O, P to O, or O to X, and then we have this one, X to P, or P to X. So I should have started by mentioning that P in this case describes the person, which is you, or here is the other person who could be your friend, and X is a third party. In this case, we consider them an enemy. So we will label X as an enemy. So if in this case we're going to consider a friend being the positive, so uh, the positive will be a friend. So anywhere you see a positive, consider that a friend. So positive definitely becomes a friend, and the negative here becomes an enemy. So once you understand that, it is easy to navigate. So I consider O a friend. So this edge sign here becomes a positive. And I consider X an enemy. And this sign, O and X, maybe they are not friends, they are enemies. So this sign will be a negative. And if that is the case, then if we can consider the theory itself, whereby it says the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and the friend of my enemy is my enemy, we can be able to define this relationship here between X and P. We can be able to define this relationship. So that brings us to the first section, the enemy. Let us describe. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. I want you to remember that we have said that the friend here is considered positive sign and the enemy here is considered a negative. So to describe this in mathematical form, I have created two triangles to describe this relationship. So we are going to consider this relationship P O X and describe it in mathematical terms. We're going to use the terms I, J, and K. I believe those ones are possible for you to understand. So suppose J is your enemy, and J is also the enemy of K. So we are looking at this one. So suppose that this one becomes my enemy, and yeah, and also O and X are enemies. O and X are enemies. they are enemies. So O and X are enemy, and P and O are enemies. So in this case, definitely the enmity we said will take a negative sign, and here it will be a negative sign. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. So we are going to describe that relationship, say P and O. So if we describe that relationship between P and O, the relationship is negative because they are enemies. And O and X, the sign here is also a negative because they are enemies. So what then is PX? PX will be the product of this PO and OX. So we could say I here represent P, J represents O, and K here represents K here represents X. So I want to um, let me just move this all together to this side. So suppose J is your enemy and J is also the enemy of K. So the sign for IJ will be a negative, right? Say -1, which is basically a negative. I'm going to call it a -1. And the sign for JK, will also be a -1. So in that case, if we want to know IK, if we want to know IK, the sign of IK, then that means if we need to know this, we will have to multiply the sign of IJ and the sign of JK, which is -1 there, -1. So sign of IK will be equal to the sign of IJ, we multiply it by the sign of JK, right? So which means this one equals to sign of IJ, we said it's -1 times -1, which yields a positive, because negative and negative yields a positive, so equals to a positive. So the eventual sign here of IK is a positive. So the enemy of my enemy becomes my friend. Have you understood the concept? So the enemy of my enemy becomes my friend. That's an alliance that has been formed in that case. So if we are to describe that relationship, we would describe it in that manner to say that I and K therefore become friends because they have a common enemy, right? Okay, so let us look at this other relationship whereby the friend of my enemy is my enemy. So suppose J is your enemy, and J at the same time is a friend of K. So in this case, the sign of IJ becomes a negative, and the sign of JK becomes a positive because they are friends. So here is a positive, and this is a negative. I just put it -1, -1. So what about IK? So the sign of IK, if we want to find that relationship, will be equal to the product of IJ times the sign of J and K. This is a product here. So the sign of IK then will be the sign of IJ, which is -1, multiplied by the sign of JK, which is a +1. Negative and positive when multiplied yields a negative. So the sign of IK here will be a -1. Hence the theory, the friend of my enemy is my enemy, because J is the enemy of I, and because J and K are enemies, then K definitely becomes my enemy. So hence I and K are enemies. So basically, that is how the relationship works. So we can simply say that the relationship that is derived here will be this. This will be the equation. Maybe I can just write it here. Maybe I write it in red and say that the sine of ik will be equal to the sine of ij times the sine of jk. So this is an equation that we have derived from this relationship, and it is actually true because how would you be able to derive or find out that this rule is true? So you would have to multiply all, so that if we want to verify its truth, then if I multiply this by this and this, it should give me a positive, which actually confirms, according to the Heider theory, that the relationship is actually balanced. You remember that the theory that Heider was coming up with is called the balance theory. It is only balanced if when you multiply this and this and this, in other words, this triangular framework, if you multiply it, it will eventually give you a positive for it to be balanced. If it gives you a negative, then it is not balanced. If it gives you a negative, if it gives you a negative, then definitely it is not balanced. So maybe we could describe that in an equation and say that the sine of ij multiplied by the sine of jk multiplied by the sine of ik, which is what we were trying to figure out, should yield a positive result to show that it is balanced. To show that it is balanced, then it should give you a positive result here. Are we together on that? So that's just to ensure that that logic actually holds. Ideally, this is how this equation holds. So do you think it is true from those findings? Maybe you can share your views on the same.